I remember the kitchen light more than the words. It was that soft yellow light over the sink, the kind that makes everything look warmer than it really is. I had just come back from the store because I forgot nutmeg, and I was standing in the hallway with my purse still on my shoulder when I heard my daughter's voice from the living room. She said, very casually, "Don't ask her to host this year. She makes everything heavy." There was a small pause after that. Someone laughed quietly. A cup touched a saucer. I didn't walk in. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there in the hallway, like someone who had opened the wrong door and found a conversation that wasn't meant for them. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Or maybe that's just what I told myself later. What I do remember clearly is that I didn't go into the living room. I set the grocery bag on the floor, hung my coat back up, and went upstairs without letting them know I was home. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not crying. Just sitting there, looking at the dresser, the framed photos, the same room I had slept in for years. The house sounded different when you listened to it from upstairs, instead of from the kitchen. The floor vents carried their voices up in pieces, like sentences that didn't belong to me anymore. I had been hosting that holiday dinner for almost 30 years. Same table. Same dishes. Same green table runner. I bought on clearance sometime in the late 90s. No one had asked me to host in a long time, but no one had told me to stop either. So I kept doing it. I suppose I thought that if I kept setting the table, they would keep showing up. Some people mistake silence for permission. That sentence came to me while I was sitting there, looking at a photo from a wedding years ago, where I stood on the edge of the frame like a guest, instead of the woman who had quietly paid for half the reception. At the time, I didn't think of it as anything unusual. Families help each other. That's what I believed. But sitting there that afternoon, something started to feel different. Not dramatic, just a quiet kind of clarity. I started thinking about small things. Not big emotional moments, small procedural things. Who paid for what? Whose name was on which account? Who signed which form? The unglamorous parts of family life. The parts no one talks about at dinner. I realized something that felt less like anger and more like administrative clarity. There were a lot of things in motion that no one seemed to notice because I had set them in motion years ago and never stopped them. Automatic transfers, shared accounts, scheduled payments, standing holiday orders. At the time, none of it felt important. It was just logistics, just making things easier for everyone. I've always been a procedural person. I like things organized, documented, confirmed. I liked knowing that things were taken care of before anyone had to worry about them. I went downstairs after I heard the front door close and their cars pull away. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like a room after a meeting has ended. On the kitchen counter, there was a notebook where I usually wrote grocery lists and holiday menus. I opened it and flipped past the recipes and the measurements and the little notes about who doesn't eat what anymore. On a blank page, I started writing something else, not a menu, not a shopping list, just a list of accounts, payments, and dates. The kind of list you make when you're preparing for a meeting or an audit. I remember the clock on the stove said 4:12 p.m. when I wrote the first line. I remember because the kitchen was very quiet, and the sound of the pen on the paper seemed louder than it should have been. Around 5, the phone rang. I looked at it, but I didn't pick it up. I had a feeling I knew what the call would be about. Something small, something logistical. What time should we come? Did you already order the ham? Do you still have the extra chairs? I let it ring. That's when I realized something that probably should have been obvious much earlier. They weren't asking if I wanted to host. They were asking if everything was already arranged. And that was the moment, sitting there with a pen in my hand and a list of accounts in front of me, that I decided not to argue, not to confront, not to explain. I decided to review the paperwork instead. That was the first quiet decision. And later, I realized it was also the one that changed everything. A few days after that afternoon in the hallway, I drove downtown to the small branch office where most of my accounts had been for years. I didn't go inside that day. I just parked across the street and sat in the car for a while, watching people go in and out with envelopes, folders, and takeaway coffee. I wasn't ready yet. Not for a conversation. I was still in the stage of wanting to see the whole picture clearly before I spoke to anyone. I've always believed that if you don't understand the structure, you shouldn't start moving walls. On the passenger seat next to me was a folder. Inside were printouts, statements, and a small ledger I had kept for years. Not because I was suspicious, just because I was raised to write things down. My mother used to say, "If it matters, put it on paper." Memory is kind, but paper is exact. Sitting there in the car, I opened the folder and started flipping through the pages. And that's when the memories started coming back. Not all at once, but in small, quiet scenes. The first one was a shoe store. My daughter was maybe 9 or 10, standing on her toes in a pair of pink ballet shoes, looking at herself in the mirror like she was already on a stage somewhere. "These are the ones," she said. "These make me look like a real dancer." The cashier told me the price, and I remember pausing for just a second, doing the math in my head, thinking about groceries and the electric bill. My daughter looked at me and said quietly, "It's okay if we can't." I picked up the box and said, "We can." That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, moving money from one envelope to another while the dishwasher hummed in the background. My husband walked in, looked at the envelopes spread out in front of me and said, "We'll figure it out." We always do. That memory sat with me for a moment while I turned the next page in the folder. The second memory came when I found a carbon copy of a check. My son was sitting across from me at the same kitchen table years later, papers spread everywhere, talking fast, explaining interest rates and deadlines, and how he just needed a little help to close on the house. "It's just temporary," he said. "I'll refinance in a year." I remember sliding the check across the table toward him. He looked relieved in a way that made me feel useful, important. "I don't know what we'd do without you," he said. At the time, I heard gratitude. Later, I understood it was something closer to dependence, though I don't think he meant it that way when he said it. I turned another page in the folder and found a hospital billing statement. That brought back the third memory. I was standing in the hallway outside a hospital room, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. My daughter-in-law was inside, asleep after a long night, and my son was talking to a billing coordinator about what insurance would and wouldn't cover. He came out, rubbed his face, and said, "There are some gaps." "I don't know how we're going to cover the rest," I said. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Are you sure?" And I remember answering, very clearly, "That's what family does." Back in the car outside the bank, I closed the folder and rested my hands on the steering wheel. Those memories didn't make me angry. That's the part people sometimes misunderstand. I wasn't sitting there feeling used or betrayed. I was sitting there feeling precise, because every one of those moments had a paper trail, a check, a transfer, a signed form. Love looks very different when you see it written in numbers and dates. Around that time, my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter about the holiday again. "What time should we come? Are you making the same pie? Do you still have the extra folding chairs?" I read the message twice before I replied. "I'm not hosting this year," I wrote. She responded almost immediately. "Oh, are you okay?" I stared at that question for a long moment. It wasn't a cruel question. It just wasn't the right one. I typed back, "Yes. I just have some appointments that week." That wasn't entirely untrue. I had already decided I was going to make some appointments. I just hadn't scheduled them yet. That evening, I called an attorney whose name I still had in an old file from when we refinanced the house years ago. I wasn't even sure he still worked, but the office number was the same. His assistant answered. and I said, I need to review some documents and possibly update some estate paperwork. She asked, Is this urgent? I thought for a moment and said, No, but it is important. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. When I hung up the phone, I stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the calendar on the wall, the one with everyone's birthdays still written in blue ink. I remember thinking that most people assume big life changes happen after arguments or dramatic moments. But in my experience, they usually begin with paperwork. And that was the week I decided I wasn't going to have a family discussion. I was going to have a professional one. The attorney's office was on the third floor of a building that still had a directory in the lobby with little plastic name strips next to each office number. His name was still there, in black letters that had probably been slid into that slot years ago. The waiting room smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. Not fresh coffee. The kind that's been sitting on a warmer too long. There were 2 chairs, a small table with neatly stacked magazines, and a framed certificate on the wall that had slightly faded where the sun hit it every afternoon. When he came out to greet me, he looked older, of course, but not different in the ways that mattered. Same calm voice. Same habit of reading a document all the way through before speaking. We sat across from each other at a large desk, and I handed him the folder I had brought from home. He opened it without comment and started reading, not skimming, reading, page by page. That's when the room went quiet, not uncomfortable. Just the kind of quiet that happens when something important is being looked at carefully. After a while, he looked up and said, When was the last time you reviewed your estate documents? About 15 years ago, I said. After my husband passed. He nodded and tapped one of the pages lightly with his pen. A lot of these accounts and assets are solely in your name, he said. But I also see a number of authorized users, transfer on death designations, and informal arrangements that aren't actually written into the estate documents. I thought that might be the case, I said. He leaned back slightly in his chair and said something very calmly that stayed with me. Informal arrangements work perfectly, he said, right up until the day they don't. I nodded, because that sounded exactly right. We spent the next hour going through everything slowly. The house, the accounts, the recurring transfers, the annual payments, the holiday vendor deposits. All the small financial structures that had been running quietly in the background for years. At one point, he paused, looked at a page again, and then looked up at me. Do you intend for these automatic transfers to continue indefinitely? He asked. That was a very precise question. Not emotional, not judgmental, just precise. No, I said. I don't think I do. He nodded once and made a small note on a yellow legal pad. We can revoke authorized users, he said. We can stop recurring transfers. We can also update the will and the trust to reflect your current intentions rather than your past assumptions. Past assumptions. That was exactly what they were. At one point, his assistant came in with 2 coffees and placed them on the desk. While she was there, he asked her to print a copy of the current authorization list for all accounts. A few minutes later, she came back with a stapled packet and placed it in front of him. He looked at the list, then turned it so I could see it. These are all the people who currently have some level of access or authorization, he said. The paperwork already had my name on it, not in a sentimental way, in a legal way. Owner, primary account holder, property holder, grantor. It's a strange feeling to see your life summarized in legal titles and account numbers. Very unromantic, very clear. We went through the revocation forms one by one. He didn't rush me. Each time he explained what the form did in very simple terms. This removes online access. This stops automatic transfers. This removes authorized user privileges. This updates the beneficiary. Designation. Every change required a signature. Every signature required a date. Procedure does not bend for feelings. It just asks for signatures. At the end of the meeting, he gathered the signed forms into a neat stack and said, "Once these are processed, the changes will take effect quietly. There won't be an announcement. Things will just stop working the way they used to." I remember folding my hands on the desk and saying, "I think that might be the only way some people will notice they were working at all." He didn't smile, but he did nod slightly, like someone who had seen this pattern before. As I stood up to leave, he said one more thing. "If you want my professional advice," he said, "structure creates clarity. And clarity tends to improve relationships, even if it doesn't feel like it at first." Outside, the air was cold and bright. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to my car, just letting that sentence settle in my mind. Structure creates clarity. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt organized. And sometimes, being organized is the most powerful change a quiet person can make. After the meeting with the attorney, life didn't suddenly become dramatic. If anything, it became very ordinary. I watered the plants. I went to the grocery store. I folded laundry and watched the evening news. The visible parts of life stayed the same. The invisible parts started changing. About a week later, I had an appointment at the bank to finalize a few of the authorization changes. The branch manager, a man named Daniel, had been there for years. He recognized me when I walked in and came around the counter to shake my hand. "We'll go into my office," he said. "It'll be more comfortable." His office had a glass wall facing the lobby, and I remember watching people stand in line while we sat at a small round table with a stack of forms between us. He went through everything slowly, just like the attorney had. "These are the recurring transfers," he said, sliding one page toward me. "These are the authorized users," he said, sliding another. "These are the linked accounts." Each time he explained what would happen after each change. "This one will stop at the end of the billing cycle. This one removes card access. This one removes online visibility." He spoke in the same calm tone the attorney had used. Not curious, not concerned, just procedural. At one point, he looked up and said, "Do you want to keep any of the current arrangements in place?" That was a fair question. I thought about it carefully before I answered. "No," I said. "I think it's time for everything to match the paperwork." He nodded, and we continued. "Sign here, initial here, date here." There's something about signing your name that many times in a row that makes you very aware of what you're agreeing to. Or, in this case, what you're no longer agreeing to. Halfway through the stack, Daniel paused and said, "Once these process, some people may contact you because things they're used to will change." "I understand," I said. He nodded again and said, "From the bank's perspective, we follow the account holder's instructions. Authorization is not permanent unless the owner wants it to be. Authorization is not permanent." That sentence stayed with me. When we finished, he gathered the papers into a folder and said, "You'll receive confirmation letters in the mail. Most of the changes will take effect within 1 to 2 billing cycles." I stood up, thanked him, and walked out into the lobby. The line was longer now. People holding deposit slips, talking quietly, looking at their phones. Normal life, normal day. But I knew that somewhere in a system I couldn't see, small switches were being turned off, small permissions were being removed, small automatic processes were coming to an end. That's the thing about systems. They don't argue, they don't accuse. They just operate based on what is authorized and what is not. About 10 days later, the first phone call came while I was standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store. "Hey," my son said, trying to sound casual. "Quick question. Did you change something with the account that handles the house payment?" I remember looking at 2 different boxes of cereal and not really seeing either of them. "Yes," I said. I reviewed my automatic transfers and made some changes. There was a short silence. "Oh," he said. "Okay. I just saw a notification that the payment didn't go through this month." "Yes," I said. "That would be because I'm no longer making that payment." Another pause, longer this time. "I thought that was coming from the family account," he said. "It was coming from my account," I replied. "I authorized it years ago. I've revoked that authorization." He exhaled slowly, not angry, just surprised. "I wish you had told me," he said. I rested my hand on the shopping cart handle and said, "I'm telling you now." We ended the call politely. No raised voices, no accusations, just information being exchanged a little later than he would have preferred. A few days after that, my neighbor Carol stopped me by the mailbox. "I saw your daughter yesterday," she said. "She looked stressed. Everything okay?" I adjusted the stack of mail in my hands and said, "I think everyone's just adjusting to some changes." Carol nodded, in that quiet way good neighbors do. "Well," she said, "if you need anything, you know where I am." "I do," I said, and I meant it. Around that same time, I received an automated email from the holiday catering company, confirming that the annual December order had not been prepaid this year, and asking if they should still reserve the date. I stared at that email for a long time. For years, my children thought that holiday dinner just appeared every December, like a tradition that ran on its own. In reality, it had always been a card in my name, a deposit I approved, a confirmation email I answered. I didn't reply to the email right away. I just filed it into a folder on my computer labeled Vendors. That was the moment I think the structure fully shifted, even though no one else knew it yet. Because the system they thought was automatic was actually just me, pressing confirm once a year. By early December, the institutional side began tightening in ways that were very quiet, but very firm. Nothing dramatic happened. No one showed up at the door with bad news. No one raised their voice. It was all paperwork and timing, and systems doing exactly what they are designed to do. I received a formal letter from the bank confirming that all recurring transfers had been terminated and that all secondary users had been removed from the authorized access list. It was a standard letter, printed on heavy paper, 2 pages, neutral language, no emotion in it at all. I read it once at the kitchen table, then placed it in the folder with the other documents. A few days later, I received confirmation from the attorney's office that the amended trust documents and the updated will had been filed and notarized. Another clean document. Stamped, dated, witnessed. Very official, very quiet. Paper has a way of making decisions feel real. Around that same time, my phone started ringing more often. Not angry calls, not dramatic calls, mostly logistical ones. "Mum, do you still have the contact for the insurance agent?" "Mom, when does the property tax bill usually come?" "Mom, what was the login for the holiday storage unit?" I answered some of those questions. Not all. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was just no longer managing everything. One evening, my daughter called, and her voice sounded different. Not frustrated. Not rushed, just tired. "I didn't realize how many things you were keeping track of," she said. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a single plate, and I remember watching the water run over my hands while I answered. "Most systems look simple when someone else is maintaining them," I said. She didn't respond right away. Then she said quietly, "I'm not calling to argue. I think we thought you liked doing all of it." I dried my hands slowly and said, "I liked being included. That's not the same thing." There was a long pause after that, not an angry pause, just a thinking pause. A few days later, I heard from Carol that my son had picked up extra shifts at work and that my daughter had cancelled a vacation she had been planning. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard that. I just noticed the shift. For a little while, performance turned into panic. Then, slowly, Panic turned into procedure. Bills got reorganized. Budgets got adjusted. Decisions got made that didn't involve me. That was when I knew the structural change had fully taken effect. Not when they were upset, not when they were surprised, but when they started adapting. Around the middle of December, I received one more document from the attorney, a final confirmation summary of the estate changes, including the new allocations and the scholarship fund we had set up in my husband's name. I remember sitting at the table with that document and running my fingers over his name printed there in formal type. For trade students, it said. For people who build things, fix things, keep things running, he would have liked that. That night I made myself a small dinner, soup and bread. I ate at the table without setting extra plates, without checking the time, without coordinating anything. Halfway through dinner, I realized something that surprised me. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt settled. Around the week of Christmas, my son came by again. This time, he didn't come in talking fast or asking questions. He walked in, set a bag of groceries on the counter, and said, "I brought these, not because you asked. I was at the store and thought you might need a few things." I looked in the bag and saw coffee, bread, and the brand of soup I usually buy. "Thank you," I said. He stood there for a moment, then said, "I get it now. Not all of it, but enough." I didn't make a speech. I just nodded. "Understanding is a process," I said. He looked around the kitchen, then back at me, and said, "Are you doing anything for Christmas?" "Yes," I said. "Just something small. With us?" he asked. I thought about that question carefully before answering. "I'm not organizing anything this year," I said. "If you want to see me, you can come see me. But I'm not running the operation anymore." He nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. And for some reason, that word fair mattered more than an apology would have in that moment. Because sorry is emotional, but fair is structural. And this whole situation had never really been about emotion. It had been about structure. Christmas morning was very quiet that year. Not the heavy kind of quiet, just a calm one. The kind of quiet that lets you hear the small sounds in a house you've lived in for a long time. I woke up without an alarm and stayed in bed for a few extra minutes, listening. The heater clicked on. The pipes shifted softly in the walls. Somewhere outside, a car door closed, and then an engine started. Ordinary sounds, nothing urgent. No schedule to manage, no timing to coordinate. For the first time in many years, the day did not depend on me. I made coffee and sat by the front window with a blanket over my knees. Across the street, the neighbors still had lights wrapped around a small tree in their yard. The lights were still on, even though it was morning. I remember thinking they actually looked better in the daylight than they did at night. Less like a performance, more like something simple and real. Around 10, there was a knock at the door. Not the doorbell, just a knock. Soft, but certain. When I opened the door, my daughter was standing there holding a small bakery box, not wrapped like a gift. Just a plain white box with a piece of tape holding it closed. "I brought something," she said. "I didn't know if you'd want company, so I brought something that doesn't require an invitation." I stepped aside and let her in. She put the box on the table and opened it. Lemon cake, slightly uneven on one side, the frosting a little thicker in the corners. "I tried to make it the way you used to," she said. "I don't think I got it right." I looked at the cake for a moment, then at her. "It looks like you tried," I said. "That matters." We sat at the table and drank coffee. No big speeches, no dramatic apologies. Just conversation that sounded like two adults who were learning how to talk to each other again. At one point, she asked where I bought the good vanilla. And we ended up talking about grocery stores for 10 minutes like nothing in the world had ever been complicated. Around noon, my son came by too. He knocked the same way she had. When he came in, he didn't start explaining anything. He just sat down at the table, took an envelope out of his jacket, and slid it toward me. "What's this?" I asked. A payment plan, he said. For what I owe you. I know you never asked for it back, but that doesn't mean I didn't owe it. I didn't open the envelope right away. I just rested my hand on it for a moment. We'll talk about that later, I said, because the money wasn't the point. The structure was the point. The recognition was the point. We ate slices of that slightly uneven lemon cake. And at one point, my daughter laughed and said, I never realized how much work you were doing every year. I thought holidays just happened. I smiled a little and said, holidays don't happen. Someone builds them. Later that afternoon, after they left, I washed 3 plates and set them in the drying rack. I didn't rush. I didn't feel that old holiday exhaustion. I just felt calm. I sat down in the living room and looked around the house. Same furniture, same walls, same pictures. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I was no longer the invisible system running in the background. I was just a person living in my own house, making my own decisions. Some people mistake silence for permission. I thought about that sentence again while I was turning off the lights that night. Silence doesn't mean you agree. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes silence just means someone is reading the paperwork, thinking carefully, and deciding what they will and will not sign their name to anymore. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even particularly sad. I'm just clear. And clarity, I've learned, is a very peaceful place to live.